Thank you for joining this, our second webinar of the new season from the Energy, Environment, Climate Action Division at Engineers Ireland. As many of you will be aware, I'm sure, we are one of many divisions and committees under the umbrella of Engineers Ireland with a specific remit to look into environmental, climate action, energy matters. And delighted to be joined this evening by a real expert on the topic of climate change adaptation. That's Dr. Conor Quinlan from the EPA. And a big thank you to Conor for joining us to talk through the recent work he's been doing in leading the delivery of the National Climate Change Risk Assessment from the EPA. Conor has a PhD in hydrology and hydrogeology and an MA in public management. And as I said, a real expert on this topic, so looking forward to his presentation. But again, a big thank you to Conor and a big thank you to you for joining us. And with that, I might hand the floor to Conor.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks very much to Engineers Ireland for the invitation to discuss this work this evening. I'm going to talk, as was described there, about climate adaptation, resilience, and specifically the work we're doing in relation to the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. I'll start off at a high level to ease ourselves into it, just a little bit about the EPA and its work on climate. The overarching vision of the EPA is that, to support Ireland living and Ireland's population living sustainably in a healthy environment that is valued and protected by all. And that's very much led from the top down by our Director General, Laura Burke, who is obviously currently the president of Engineers Ireland. So we have a very close relationship with the organisation. In relation to our work on climate change and climate change related activities, we operate across a broad number of areas. So many of you are probably familiar with the emissions statistics reports that the EPA produce. They're the greenhouse gas inventories and projections. So the inventories of emissions to date and the projections out to 2030, and an analysis as to whether or not we're on track to meet our commitments, and also air pollutant inventories and projections. In relation to my own area, I'm the manager for the Climate Services section in the EPA, and I cover our work in relation to the National Dialogue on Climate Action. So that is stakeholder engagement, social and behavioural science, and behavioural interventions. Work around the social side of, meeting the population where they are in relation to climate action and trying to understand how we can actually, get from scientific knowledge to behavioural change to drive climate action. And that is hugely informed by the science and the research work that we do in relation to climate behaviour and change insights. You may have heard of the climate change in the Irish Mind study. We're in the process of publishing the pieces of wave 2 of that study currently. I'm also responsible for the EPA's work on climate change adaptation. One of the headline projects at the moment is the delivery of the first National Climate Change Risk Assessment for Ireland, which is what I'm going to talk about this evening. We're also responsible for providing the Climate Ireland portal, which is Ireland's national adaptation platform. So we have up there the climate change projections that are produced under the National Framework for Climate Services, specifically now comprising of the Translate suite of projections completed by Met Éireann, for example, and other relevant adaptation data sets, links out to data sets provided by the GSI, Marine Institute, OPW, etc., and our own EPA data as well. There's also on that platform guidance on adaptation and links out to the existing sectoral adaptation plans, local authority adaptation plans, etc., and adaptation-related research. As part of the Climate Ireland task, we also run the Climate Ireland Adaptation Network, which is a practitioner network aimed at those working in adaptation, be it through infrastructure, design, engineering, policy, operations, etc. And it's just a peer network that we're going to be developing further in the next few years. We actually have our second in-person annual seminar next Wednesday on the 9th of October that's looking at some of the issues around adaptation planning and moving that forward, just to inform the conversation amongst practitioners, and details on how you could join that at the end of the presentation. We also play a significant role in Ireland's work and interaction with the UNFCCC and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's, we have a large representation at that international engagement, where the consensus about where we are globally in relation to climate change and what we can do about it is reached We also have a role in the coordination of JPI Climate, that's research across the European Union. And we've recently published Ireland's Climate Change Assessment, which is essentially a national version of the IPCC IR report series for Ireland. So I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. We then have a team that looks at climate science and policy analysis. So it's trying to get that international science or adaptation science or inventories, projections, information into policy to inform policy. So it's that bridge knowledge to policy that we now have a specific team to do, which is a new development. It was only set up last year. And finally, then we are responsible for administering the emissions trading schemes. That's the EU ETS, and also CBAM, we're the national competent authority in that area as well. That's the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So at the start of this year, it was a culmination of, I think, a 3-year process. We published Ireland's Climate Change Assessment. So this was a significant project undertaken by the main climate researchers and academics in Ireland. It was published in 4 volumes. The first looked at, and it's to provide a comprehensive, up-to-date summary of the state of knowledge across all facets of climate change and climate action for Ireland. The first volume looked at climate science in a changing world. So what climate change have we experienced to date? What's the evidence for that? And where is it likely to go in terms of projections? The second volume looked at achieving climate neutrality by 2050. What has to be done to get to net neutrality? The third then was being prepared. The third volume was being prepared for Ireland's future climate, the adaptation, the resilience chapter, essentially. And the fourth then was realizing the benefits from transition and transformation. And that's a very interesting volume because that volume doesn't actually exist in the IPCC report series. That was an additional one. So there was a lot of thought into the structure of it to look at the co-benefits, the transformational change, the societal and the technical pieces around that, and how we could, I suppose, summarize the benefits. So there's very large reports for each of the 4 volumes. There's a summary for policymakers, and there's also a synthesis report of the 4 volumes. They're all available on epa.ie. And as far as I know, we're the only country in the world that has such a comprehensive and up-to-date suite of reports that, more or less exactly mirror the IPCC report. So I'd invite everyone to read those, and they're a very authoritative report series on, for the current knowledge nationally in relation to climate change impacts and action in terms of policy options. Looking at that third volume, being prepared for Ireland's future climate, we I suppose, look at stating the obvious. We know we're going to experience significant impacts. We have to be resilient to what we've experienced so far and the future projected impacts of climate change. And we know from the attribution study that was done on Middleton last year that we're now looking at these things being, far more probable and likely and frequent and of greater magnitude than they were in the past. The assessment from the report is that to date, implementation of adaptation has been slower and more fragmented than would be ideal. And that's, I think, a fair assessment of the past number of years. Doing better will require money. It will require a lot of collaboration, de-siloing, working with people and nature, properly valuing and incorporating nature-based solutions where they work and knowing why you're incorporating them and looking at those multiple benefits across sectors. Monitoring and evaluating outcomes and having very clear indicators to define resilience, levels of protection, or whatever it may be. And I think there's a serious opportunity for the engineering community to contribute to that in a meaningful way, because how we do that in future isn't going to be incredibly different to how we do it in the past. We just need to do it in the context of climate change projections, I think. And we do need to increase, and join up public and private sector involvement. The private sector is obviously doing a huge amount under CSRD, etc. I think nature is going to come more into the picture, but it's operating in a very separate stream to a lot of the public sector activity on this. The volume, concludes as well that there are adaptation benefits now, and while we, there's a cost involved with adaptation, it should be seen as an investment rather than a short-term cost. There's plenty of evidence out there internationally that the earlier you put the appropriate interventions in place, the cheaper they are in the long run. So in terms of, I suppose the evidence as to why this is important. We are already in a changing climate. If you look at the current 30-year averages compared to the previous set, we know we have an extra month's rainfall, more or less, around the country. You can see the graph on the left there is, I think that's annual temperature in degrees Celsius, and you can see over the past 30 years steadily rising in Ireland. We know we're about 1.1, I think, degrees higher than the pre-industrial here, or the baseline. So we're seeing that warming in line with wider regional and global trends. And as I mentioned, the Middleton flooding, that was, I think, the first event for which there have been robust attribution studies completed for Ireland. We can say with some confidence now that the likes of that event, the magnitude and the frequency of them, both, they are increasing, they have increased, and they're likely to increase again in the future. So we are living in a very different climate than, we would have had even, I suppose, when many of us were children, and it's going to keep changing. We can look at sea level rise. We're very, very confident that we're going to see increased sea level rise. It's just a question of how bad. But we have a good idea of where the minimum is likely to be. In terms of where this goes into the future, we now have the Translate set of projections that are produced by Met Air and form part of that National Framework for Climate Services, or they're coordinated under that. And they're a great base for producing climate services out from them. So next year, if the EPA produce river flow estimates, we base them on the Translate projections, for example. And we'll try and take these into account across sectors, developing out climate services so that they're comparable and can be used on the same scenarios or temperature thresholds or time horizons when we do cross-sectoral analysis. And they've really, begun to facilitate integrated assessments such as the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. When we look at this data, what's the path we're on? What's the path we're likely to be on? This diagram on the right-hand side shows kind of early action is the top line, and late action in terms of emissions reduction is the bottom line. And then just sensitivities of the models from left to right. Late action is, what kind of worst case scenario. So bottom right there is worst case scenario. You're up to kind of 4 degrees average temperature change by the end of the century. We're probably on a mid-action trajectory at the moment, and that's what we've chosen, a kind of an RCP 4.5, and RCP 8.5 is a worst-case scenario for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. So we're definitely heading to a warmer world. Whether it's 2.5, 3 degrees by the end of the century, we don't know yet. We just have to make a decision around what projections we use for risk assessment, and then what level of protection we want to design to. But there is, quite strong evidence that this is essentially the general direction of travel. Sorry. So what will the future impacts be, and how are they related to each other? It's well established at this stage, here and everywhere else, that climate change impacts, it's going to impact most, if not all, sections of society, and not in a siloed way. Our ecosystems, marine, terrestrial, and freshwater, will obviously experience a very different context in terms of the precipitation, evapotranspiration, temperature, seasonality, extremes as well. It's quite likely in some cases that average values for some of those variables may stay the same, but they could be, your extremes could be greater at both ends in terms of drier periods and wetter periods. That obviously, the same applies to agriculture, forestry, and land use. Also with the arrival of invasives and pests and diseases as the temperature becomes more favorable to them. And that cascades into food security and I suppose civil society. Our coastal environments obviously have mentioned sea level rise. The sea level is now going to continue to rise for hundreds and hundreds of years, no matter what we do. It's just a question of how fast it rises and where it stops. But to say that we've bought a minimum of 0.6 of a meter and probably 1 to 1.5 meters plus is quite plausible currently. And that will obviously, impact softer coasts and more low-lying coasts far more than steep rocky coasts. But it'll also be probably accompanied with increasing severity of storms, storm surges, erosive capacity, etc. So that is something that has to be considered. And as we know, a huge proportion of our population live very near coasts, and most of our main cities are located in very low-lying areas on the coast. Business, industry, and tourism. Obviously, tourism, it could be in some ways a benefit for the country. We could experience a lot more tourism as a result of being a more hospitable climate in comparison to Southern Europe. You can see the beginnings of that now. That brings questions around the carrying capacity of rural areas, whose maybe their freshwater supply and their wastewater infrastructure may be at capacity now. What's that going to be like if you massively increase tourism there? For business and for industry, there's the physical risk of climate. There's also the transition risk in terms of decarbonisation, and then there's the insurance risk, sea level rise, flooding, drought, etc. The devaluing of collateral in that instance as well. So it's definitely, it will cascade into finance and the economy. Water, I've probably described it through the other aspects already, but we're quite likely to see, or the projections would indicate, an increase in the number and severity of droughts, coupled also with an increase in flooding. So your water environment becomes more extreme. That river you see there, you have more periods than historically when it's at a lower flow, and then you also probably have more frequent, highly erosive, destructive flood flows coming down that channel. And you have to build, maintain, and plan your aquatic environment to cope with that and to become resilient to that. In terms of the built environment, heritage in rural communities, our islands, a lot of our heritage buildings, they're in very vulnerable places, as I've said. They're very vulnerably constructed. They're not designed for the more intense storms or the more intense rainfall events that we get that can damage heritage sites, wash them away. It can devalue property as well. Communities may have to leave certain places. You're cascading into the social realm there and social system and the social contract even in a very big way in terms of how that's managed and considered. And it's a piece that sometimes gets left out of hard infrastructure assessment and cost benefit assessment. So I think it's something that, we're committed to it under the IPCC risk framework, and I'll come to that later, but it's something that we really have to consider. Critical infrastructure, obviously transport links, communication links, etc., vitally important. And in this, potential future with more, or likely future with more storms and extreme events, your early warning systems, your communication networks, vital as well, because that's, it's not just walls and hard defenses that are going to protect us. It's just allowing us to be dynamic and move populations quicker and react to these things. So we have to consider that as well. And health and well-being, as I've said, you can see quite likely the emergence of especially tick-borne diseases, heat wave issues, and we have that, the emergence of greater hazards there, coupled with a larger and an older population. So there'll be a significantly increased burden by 2050, even by the aging population alone, before you bring climate change in on top of it. So they will cascade into each other, trying to capture how those risks cascade across, and then look outside even at transboundary risks in terms of food security. If it's, it becomes less feasible to grow food in other places, etc., you have to get a handle on that. And we haven't even begun to mention at this stage your tipping points, such as the AMOC or Siberian permafrost, etc. They have to be considered in a very different way, but we can't ignore them either. So how do we manage what we're going to face? There's a lot of, buzzwords frequently bandied around here: adaptation, resilience, all the rest of it. And I've even seen in some places adaptation referred to as a risk in itself. And maladaptation, it's perfectly valid to say that maladaptation is not something that we where we want to end up, which is just adapting incorrectly. So, for example, if we were to build massive flood defenses, that then it may destroy the low flows in our rivers, we'd be in an even worse situation for droughts. So that's an example of maladaptation. But just to clarify the terminology, risk assessment is identifying the problems that we're likely to have to tackle. Adaptation is the problem-solving process, and resilience is the outcome we want to get to. So we want to ensure that through whatever adaptive actions we've taken, that the climate impacts we're going to face impact us or discommode us as little as possible in the future. We aim to be resilient. Now, there's a limit to that, but we'll aim to be as resilient as we can, given the projected impacts of climate change. So the EPA was tasked under the Climate Action Plan this year with developing Ireland's first dedicated climate change risk assessment that would, for the first time, look across all sectors and set out the priority impacts of climate change for Ireland. And the output of that is to be a national climate change risk register, prioritised both by the magnitude of impact, the consequence, and the urgency of action required to address identified tasks. And that's across all of the policy areas, the adaptation sectors, etc. And it's in the context of the European Climate Change Risk Assessment and the European Adaptation Strategy being published. The EUCRA was published earlier this year and uses a systems approach and there's EU adaptation sectors. So it was in the context of all of that work that we have been asked to produce this cross-cutting risk assessment for Ireland that will inform sectoral adaptation planning. So the approach that we've taken to this, having looked at fully quantitative and semi-quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches, I think the risk assessments contained in the first iterations of the sectoral adaptation plans were largely qualitative, which was, it was appropriate as a first step. At this point, we now have the data, we have the projections, we have the technical capability, I think, to move to a first iteration of a semi-quantitative national climate change risk assessment. That's very much in line with what's being done in the UK and in New Zealand. And it provides an approach that can be repeated, it can be scaled, and it will allow us to build on this to produce second, third, etc. iterations of the risk assessment as is required in the future. You wouldn't complete a fully quantitative risk assessment for a national risk assessment. That's more of a project level thing, but to bring as much data as you can and as appropriately as you can to inform the magnitude of the risks, etc., is where this is landing internationally, and that's the approach that we've followed. And looking across all those policy areas, it will identify areas where action needs to be prioritized to make Ireland more resilient. And I suppose to point out where the effort and the money should go and improve the robustness of policy. It also provides really consistent evidence base on which to inform the national adaptation framework, and it provides a national reference for updating the local authority climate action plans, sectoral and other specific plans. I mean, all plans really now should have, all long-term plans should have an adaptation element in them. I can't see how they wouldn't. So we've taken a three-stage approach to doing this then. The first is to identify risks and opportunities. That's a long list of risks. What are all the potential theoretical risks faced by Ireland based on the projections that we have and the data that we have and the evidence that exists? Second, to assess that, where and when might these risks be realized? What is our exposure, our vulnerability, the timing, etc. And then so that gives us a kind of a gross risk across different timelines. And then we need to see what adaptation has been taken to date and what adaptation action is planned. And that will give us a kind of a net position on risk. And you can then look at the urgency required to address those net risks. So as I said, it's semi-quantitative. It follows the approach taken in the UK and New Zealand. And the method report, we're just about to update it actually, but the method report was published earlier this year and is available from climateireland.ie. There'll also be sectoral technical guidance for sectoral risk assessments that align with this, and that will be published in the coming weeks. Stakeholder engagement is a hugely important part of this process, and the NCCRA is steered by a project steering committee. I think there are 11 members on the project steering committee. There's two expert groups then. There's a climate and socioeconomic expert working group and a thematic expert working group. There's a couple of dozen people on those groups in total. And then there's wider, I suppose, stakeholders that have been involved in adaptation processes before, and we've broadened that out. And there are well over 100 of those that have been feeding in a structured and systematic way into the NCCRA method development, technical guidance development, and risk register development process since it started in January this year. There has been a massive amount of work, and I should actually, at this point, give due credit to Dr. Barry O'Dwyer and Dr. James Fitton from KPMG Sustainable Futures, who are leading this project, the technical work in this project, and they've and Aoife Doyle in KPMG as well has led the stakeholder engagement piece. There has been a massive amount of work at a very intense pace over the last 10 months or 9 months, I should say, and we're still on track to produce this by early next year. So stakeholder engagement and making sure all voices are heard it has been a very important part of this process, and has, I think, led to the outputs being significantly improved and quite broad in their perspective. In terms of risk definition, so a lot of us are familiar with risk assessment over the years. When you look at the IPCC conception of risk, it's slightly different in that you have your hazards. So that's your climate hazards, your precipitation, your wind, your sea level rise. You have your exposure. Where is your infrastructure? Where is your farmland? Where are your turbines, etc.? Where are your schools, your hospitals, your roads? And that's, I suppose, historically how you would have done a risk assessment. There's a third element that that we have to take into account because we've signed up to this, which is the socioeconomic vulnerability of the population. So there's very much an aim of treating everybody equitably. So you need to see who's vulnerable and how they're vulnerable to each hazard. They tend to be the older, the younger, the poorer, the less well-educated, etc. People who they can't bounce back from climate impacts as easily as affluent, well-educated, middle-aged people. And that has to be taken into account both in the risk assessment and in the adaptation action. So it's a bit of a new departure. It's complex. And however complex it is at identifying vulnerability, in the present day, it gets very complex when you try and project vulnerability and where vulnerable people are and who they'll be into 2050. That's part of what we're trying to do. So when we take our risks across all those sectors, we try and work out impact change. We're trying to map out as best we can at a national, at a high level, how risks cascade between sectors so we can make the appropriate links. Now, this is from the EU CRA. It's not completely appropriate to Ireland, but at this stage, it's the example that we use. So if you look at the climate hazard, a drought, that cascades into agriculture, it causes lower groundwater levels. It causes increased low flow situations in rivers and lakes. If you look at the agricultural impacts of that, it causes an increase in irrigation, which is the feedback loop into your low water levels. There's significantly increased water demand and competition in sectors. This can lead to decreases overall in water availability, failure of the minimum environmental flow, or the E-flow, and water scarcity on the human side of the equation. So where do we map these risks to? So on the environmental side, there's risks to aquatic and wetland ecosystems and their services due to reductions in low flows, and that maps across to the biodiversity sector. There's risks to crop production, and that maps to the food security sector and agri-food and industry, etc. Risk to population and economic sectors due to water scarcity, which is self-evident, and risks to electricity disruption due to the impacts of heat and drought on energy production and peak demand, and also hydro in terms of water availability, and that maps into the energy sector. Thankfully, we're not probably likely to suffer from the risk in the bottom right, which is the risk to winter tourism, because I don't think we have any of it. Anyway, looking at our three-stage assessment then in a bit more detail, the risk identification stage 1, to undertake a high-level climate risk screening to identify those, and that gives us an initial national risk and opportunities register. The stage 2 assessment then is when we go through that within a GIS using as much quantitative data as we can, and we're going to report these on a NUTS level, so it'll be a regional level for Ireland, and that's where we try to account for the hazard, the exposure, and to the extent that we can currently, the vulnerability. And that allows us to revise our climate change risk and opportunity register based on the level of exposure, vulnerability, and timing of the potential impact at a regional level. Do we have 5,000 people currently that might be at heat wave risk in the southeast? That might increase significantly to 90,000 people over the same period by 2050. And then we have to look at the in stage 3, the assessment of adaptation measures and urgency. So if we look at flooding, where have we put flood schemes in? Where are they planned? Where do we have left? Where are coastal populations vulnerable, etc.? And not just look at the gap between what's built now and the gross risk, but look at what's planned and try and get a sense of what additional actions above and beyond those already planned do we have to incorporate, and how urgently do we need to do that? What are the lead-in times for those? The hard infrastructure adaptation actions, there's a massive lead-in time. There's enough of a debate here at the moment about how we build infrastructure. We're familiar with that. They take a long time. Early warning systems, social support systems, etc., they can be put in much quicker. In many cases, with sea level rise, you will eventually be talking about managed retreat. There is a huge social and economic aspect to that, and there's lead-in times for all those processes. So I think you have to, that's what we're trying to get at in stage 3 at a very high national level to see, based on the quantitative data such that it exists, which are the most urgent risks that need to be addressed. And then, to talk about the consequence, how we get to that piece around looking at consequence. So we'll do that GIS work where we look at the exposure at the different timelines. And I should have said, we're looking at, I think I mentioned it earlier on, we're looking at the present day, we're looking at 2050, and we're looking at 2100. In terms of scenarios, the path that we're on is aligning pretty much to RCP 4.5. So we're taking that as the best case scenario. RCP 8.5 is a worst case scenario for illustrative purposes. This doesn't contradict the national climate objective. Even if we were to reach net zero by 2050, we would then be in the great position of not contributing to climate change by 2050, but we will still have to continue to adapt to the sum total of global emissions. So it's only prudent to certainly risk assess to the path that we're on, but I would say to plan for the path that we're on as well. So when we get to assessing the consequence piece in the risk assessment, we have 4 levels of consequences, 2 consequence tables that are interrelated. I'll just illustrate those here. Catastrophic is very, very large and frequent damage or irreversible loss or a very large extent or very high pervasiveness of impact or irreversible cascading effects beyond system boundaries. They are informed by reports and expert observation, and that's why those expert working groups are there. The damage and the extent and pervasiveness, they're informed by the GIS piece, the detailed semi-quantitative assessment. As you can see, you move down to critical, substantial, and limited, where you're trying to capture the range of impact. We then take when we've looked at a risk through that lens, we look at it through a kind of a quantification piece. So, and these are, I should say, there's a degree of subjectivity about how we will apply these, and it's an or, it's not an and. So you see there a limited impact at 2050 in any given year would be a cost of 0.05% of GNI star. That's the particular Irish GNI metric that strips out the multinationals. The impact on people would cause less than 1 death, less than 10 health impacts, and less than 100 people affected. Or it could impact less than 7,000 hectares of land lost or severely damaged, less than 1% of valued habitat or landscape types, etc. And that you can see that ranking moves up as you go through substantial, critical, catastrophic. So there's been a lot of discussion around these. And we're saying that a catastrophic impact on an annual basis would have an impact of 2.9 billion euros in today's money, cause over 100 deaths or 1,000 health impacts, and cause maybe, for example, 10% of the land area to be lost or severely damaged. That does work as a ranking system. It's very subjective. You can argue the boundaries all day, but it does give you, an idea of it allows you to rank the risks in a reasonable way. And I think, if you were to lose 10% of your land, I don't think anyone would argue that you would list that as catastrophic. So the boundaries of those can be argued and debated, but they're in line with the other, I suppose, peer examples in the EU CRA. This then feeds into the decision urgency piece. And again, a bit of judgment is going to be needed here, but there's a watching brief. So evidence in these areas should be kept under review with continuous monitoring of risk levels and adaptation activity. Potentially something like the tipping points might fall in there, the AMOC, the Gulf Stream, etc. Maybe the best thing to do is to just gather as much scientific evidence on that for now. When you get up to more action needed, that could be about integrated catchment management, the achievement of river basin management plan objectives in the short term as the best way of making your aquatic environment resilient into the long term. Planning now if we're going to need hard engineering to protect our transport networks, our communications networks, etc. So that allows us then, taking account of lead-in times. And what we're doing there is trying to identify what needs to be done in the next 5 years so that it can inform the sectoral adaptation plans. So when the NCCRA produces its prioritized list of climate risks for the country, that will feed into adaptation planning, the development of the climate action plans. It will inform the NAF and it will inform the sectoral adaptation plans. They will then carry out sectoral risk assessments that will sit underneath the NCCRA, will be more detailed, probably look into the risks that are relevant to them in more detail, and using the technical guidance aligned to it methodologically, so that they're looking at the population projections for 2050 and the other non-climatological data sets, etc., in a harmonized way, and looking at sea level rise and flooding insofar as we can at those time periods. And the team from KPMG and ourselves and the OPW have done some work lately too, I suppose, it's an interim measure to link the OPW future flood risk scenarios to the Translate projections, so that we can conservatively estimate flood impact and coastal inundation impact for the mid-century and the late century. But there's questions then remain when we have this information. We need, I think, probably to define resilience more clearly. Our national climate objective is essentially that we're climate neutral and that we're resilient. What does resilience mean? And there's obviously that projection pathway we're on. What level of climate impact or protection do we want? Do we want to be protected to the expected impacts of RCP 4.5 by 2050, etc.? Now, France are in the process of bringing in technical guidance that says they should be resilient to a 3-degree global rise in temperature by 2100, which is 4 degrees for France. Like, what they're facing in the southern half of their country is quite extreme by comparison to us. But there's a movement internationally towards those kind of technical objectives or levels of protection. How do we make decisions under uncertainty? The data that we have will be standardized, but it will probably never be more certain than it is now. There will always be uncertainty here. There is learning by doing. What decision making criteria are we comfortable with in that context? And then indicators, really important. MARI and ourselves and TII finished a pilot earlier this year looking at indicators, and TII were able to identify some potential outcome indicators, resilience indicators, and they're really the most important ones, because there are hazard indicators, process indicators, and resilience indicators. You need to get to the resilience indicators. They're really the only ones that matter at the end of the day. How can we measure whether or not our system is resilient to the protected or projected impacts it's going to face? And the final thoughts then on this from a wider EPA adaptation perspective. I think it's fair to say now everyone is going to have to wear an adaptation hat. This is similar to health and safety 25 years ago. It might be seen as an imposition or an other. This is very much the space we're all going to have to occupy. Anyone involved in long-term planning from now on, adaptation is synonymous with it, because the climate data in the past is no longer, an indicator of the climate data for the future. Vulnerability, equity, and justice are key components of resilience that many of us are not used to incorporating, and we are bound to incorporate them into this. And there is a lot of work underway to try and understand how we can and should best do that. In relation to just getting very practical about it, we need to call out magical thinking if and where we see it. All climate change is going to do, and not all it's going to do, but what it is going to do, it's going to exacerbate many existing environmental and sectoral issues. Achieving the objectives of existing plans, such as the River Basin Management Plan, the National Marine Planning Framework, the Biodiversity Action Plan, etc., they're probably the most effective adaptation actions we can take, because resilient ecosystems and natural systems, or healthy ecosystems, I should say, are resilient systems. We also need to ensure that infrastructural plans fully take account of, cross-beneficial nature-based solutions. So, for example, you might incorporate nature-based solutions into a flood scheme, not just because they might ameliorate some floods, but they'll also be hugely beneficial in terms of sustaining the low flows in the system when there's not a flood. And the incorporation into those in cost-benefit analyses is also hugely important. The final thing I'll say is that there is progress on this, and it's, we have to give credit where credit's due. The Irish Climate Change Assessment said to date things haven't been perfect. They haven't, but there's been a huge speeding up of development in this area in the past 5 years. We now have the Climate Ireland National Adaptation Platform. We have a national set of projections and a national framework for climate services. We have the National Risk Assessment. We have a new NAF. We're going to have, we have the Local Authority Climate Action Plans, which bring together adaptation and mitigation for the first time. We're going to have new sectoral adaptation plans. And, there's a massive amount of work underway in the space. And also recently, the EPA put the requirement for an adaptation plan into a license for the first time, an annual adaptation plan. So it's coming into regulation in line, I think, with other European countries, and we are making progress. There's more to do, but we are definitely making progress and have gone from a point of being a bit behind others in Europe, I think, to leading on some aspects of it. So I think we should take heart from that. So just leave you with this. The Climate Ireland Adaptation Network is a practitioner network. We love as many people as possible to join it. If you email climateireland@epa.ie, we'll sign you up to the network, and there's a quarterly newsletter that tells you about all relevant adaptation things from an Irish perspective. So I hope that was interesting. Thank you very much.